I want to welcome everyone to day 2 of the Northwest Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Symposium. My name is Emily Fusco, and I am the Northwest Risk Network Coordinator. The rest of our Northwest Risk Core team is here too. So we have Nicole DiCrepio, Lindsay Thurman, and they're both from the USGS Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. We've got Jen Poirier from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Rachel Gregg from Environmental Science Associates. And you'll meet most of these folks today as they moderate the sessions. So we have some great talks lined up for y'all, but before we get going, I want to take a couple of minutes to make sure everyone is oriented in Zoom. All right, so there are a couple of important ways that you can interact with the event speakers today. The first is by using the chat feature. You can use the chat feature to send questions to the speakers and the symposium organizers. And you can send these questions at any time, and the moderators will ask as many questions as time allows during the question and answer sessions. You can also use the reaction button to send things like thumbs up or applause during the presentations. And this is a great way to let folks know when maybe a particular point really resonates with you, or to let the speaker know that you like what you're learning. I think the reaction feature is really fun, and I do encourage you all to use it. If you do not see those buttons on your Zoom screen, then try hovering your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, and they might pop up for you there. You might see, if you don't see those buttons, you might see a more button. And if you click that more button, you might find your options for chat and react under that menu. I also want to point out that you can change the way your screen looks by clicking on the view button, and that's in the top right of your screen. And you can use this to move in and out of full screen mode, for example. You can also use it to move in between gallery and speaker modes. And then you can also change the way that you see other people's reactions. So there are 3 choices for that. You have the full option, and so that's where the reactions from other people kind of float up from the bottom right of your screen. You can click the compact mode, and so other people's reactions appear, but they don't float up from your screen, and they kind of disappear a little bit more quickly. And then if you think these reactions are kind of just distracting, or you don't want to see them for whatever reason, you can also put on the hidden mode. And if you click that, then you won't see anybody's reactions at all. You can use your current Zoom link to access all of the talks and panels for today. And we have a lot going on our schedule today. So we're going to start first with our keynote, and then we'll move into these back-to-back panels that highlight some specific actions folks are taking to incorporate climate change into their management. And then we're going to end with a session that looks to what we might expect to see in the future related to invasive species and climate change in our region. You can see a full detailed agenda and speaker bios on our website, and I will put a link for that in the chat shortly. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole DiCrepio so that she can introduce our keynote for today.
Great, thank you, Emily, and welcome again, everyone. I'm Nicole DiCrepio. I'm the director for the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Happy to be with you again here today on day 2. I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for our symposium, and I'm so happy to have Sarah Ray, who is the chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt, with us. If you maybe joined us 2 years ago for our first Northwest Risk Symposium, Sarah was one of our featured speakers who spoke about climate grief and climate emotion, and it was such a powerful talk. We had so many people that her talk really resonated with, and so we're just really delighted that she can be with us again here today. So just a little bit more about Sarah. Her areas of interest are environmental justice, environmental humanities, and bridging disability, critical race theory, and social justice with interdisciplinary environmental studies. Her current work is on the role of emotions, mindsets, and collective wisdom in climate justice activism, especially among younger generations. This shift in focus was motivated by the despair she started observing in her students about a decade ago. Focusing on the role of emotions in climate justice advocacy, Sarah Ray now teaches, researches, writes, and facilitates workshops and mindfulness courses on the interplay of inner resilience and collective action. She has a lot of books and writings and popular magazines and publications, of course. I really encourage you to seek out some of her writings. And we are just so delighted to have her with us today. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for the invitation and for having me back and for the positive response you reported from the last time. That's just so gratifying. And I hope that today's presentation has a similar effect. We can only hope. And yeah, I look forward to questions and certainly hope to have some time for that. The 20-minute slot is really difficult for me, so I apologize. I'm going to really try to be on time for this. So I have a slightly different talk today just because it's been a couple of years and I've updated some of the slides and some of my ideas. And yeah, there's been a lot that's happened in the research area in this space. Actually, I took a leave of absence last year and really dove into it sort of full time. So I'm kind of, my brain is exploding with all this research for sure. Back at work now, as you can see, I'm in my office. So thank you for having me and the introduction, and just make sure that my slideshow works. I'm just going to ask maybe one of the speakers to make sure I have a thumbs up on this. Does this work? One of my
You can see it looks great.
Okay, it's good. It's working. Okay, great. So just a little bit of sort of the jumping into the shallow end of the pool of what I'm talking about today and what I want to offer you all. My area of research has moved to thinking about the role of emotions in climate work in general, so really broadly. And this is now relying on the research of folks working in psychology, working in all kinds of different spaces. And that's the fun of being an interdisciplinary person, is I can just kind of decide one day I want to go dive into 15 other different bodies of research and figure out what I can, how I can solve a problem that I'm seeing. So the problem, of course, was if we don't have the emotional resilience to do the work of protecting the environment and trying to reduce the implications of climate change, then we won't be able to do those things, and it will become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I started seeing my students who were immersed in all of the doom and gloom narratives of about 10 years ago. So kind of like second generation Al Gore style inconvenient truth generation. And things were just before the election of Donald Trump in 2016, there was already a sense that things were going really bad in terms of racial justice, environmental stuff, authoritarianism, all kinds of stuff. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. You know what I'm talking about. But I thought to myself, these students aren't even going to be able to walk across a graduation stage or even get up to come to class, much less save the world, as we are hoping they will do, if they do not have access to some of these tools. And so I said, who's got these tools? What are the tools? Wisdom traditions, activists that have been working for generations for civil rights and all different types of movements. How did they keep going despite setbacks without any evidence that things would go well? What kinds of tools are coming out of psychology to help my students think about what it is that they need in order to keep doing the work and keep showing up and keep themselves resilient? And so my question was less, what kinds of impacts does climate change have on mental health? That is a whole body of research that I find very fascinating, but kind of the reverse, actually. How much does our mental health impact our ability to cope with climate change, to fix climate change, to mitigate, adapt to climate change? So it's a little bit of a reversal of that question. Although I think they're both important. So what's the sort of lay of the land of thinking about climate anxiety? This is what this first slide is a little bit about. So what is climate anxiety? What are eco-grief? What are these terms? There's a whole crop of terms coming up right now to try to put words on this interface between human emotions, which we have a huge, we know about the emotion wheel and all of the vocabulary around getting really granular about different categories of emotions. But we don't have a ton of language around human emotions in relationship to the more than human world. And so other languages often do. And folks like Glenn Albrecht, who coined the term solastalgia, is trying to invent a whole kind of vocabulary around human relationships with the more than human world. Climate anxiety and eco-grief are sort of two of those words that have become very popular in recent years. One of the first places that it was starting to be studied was with the American Psychological Association. Of course, that makes sense. thinking about the mental health impacts of climate change. Like I said, that is a whole body of research being conducted right now. Very interesting, but a little bit tangential to what I'm interested in. More so for me is the work of someone like the clinician Leslie Davenport, who published a book a few years ago called Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change. And this was the first book I came across that I thought, oh, this is what's wrong with my students. I need to read this book, right? This was the first thing that I dove into when I first started turning my attention to this research. And again, Glenn Albrecht's work, his most recent book is called Earth Emotions, New Words for a New World. And his argument here is that if we don't have the language to talk about what's happening, we're not going to notice it, identify it, and therefore figure out how to address the problems. It's a reflection of our lack of sensitivity to what's going on that we don't have language around it. And then, of course, we've started to see a rash of, we've seen multiple of this, of climate suicides around the crisis of climate change. And so we see the sort of worst effects of mental health and climate change converging over very high profile climate suicides of David Buckell, and then later Wynn Bruce, that was last year. And as a person who's experiencing and on the front lines, the mental health crisis of college age students all the time, and trying to tease through how much of that might be related to what's happening planetarily, this is a very scary, frightening, logical conclusion of climate anxiety. And then, of course, we have people who are experiencing climate change currently in present time. In, for example, the Pacific Climate Warriors protesting around COP26, I believe it was, or maybe it was COP25, trying to really bring attention to sea level rise, what's happening to low-lying nations, and like, for example, in the South Pacific, and trying to rewrite the narrative around what it is that's happening with climate change is not inevitable, but rather a story that we can decide how the fate is going to turn out. And so this psychology around how we're going to engage with climate change and how we're going to wake up every morning and do the work we're doing has everything to do with whether we're living in a story of an inevitable doom or living in a story of some kind of turning around, some kind of new world on the horizon that people are collectively working together to bring about. And so I really like to bring to the fore how essential these stories are to especially frontline communities, because the psychology, the resilient psychology that they exhibit is really a model for how those of us who are more or less insulated from these immediate effects will need to be building these skills, if not now, certainly in the future. And then, of course, folks like Chris Jordan, he's a documentarian. If you have seen the film Midway, you know that he spent a lot of time documenting the plastics in albatross stomachs and became very, very depressed, spiraled into a severe depression for several years after doing that documentary. Just to give an example of how it is, I see him as sort of like a famous version of what my students and many scientists on the front lines of this work, including many of you, might be feeling when you're actually doing the work of documenting extinction or crisis or impact. And I love the film How to Let Go of the World, and love all the things climate can't change, because in this film, Josh Fox really walks us through the emotional journey of facing the reality of climate change once you open your heart and mind to the significance of what's happening. And I use this example sort of to think about what is the arc. He really takes us through what I consider the classic arc of our emotional engagement with the realities of the climate. We see climate anxiety making a debut in popular culture in this popular show, Big Little Lies, when the 8-year-old daughter of the Laura Dern character here gets actually hospitalized for fainting in her class all the time because the teacher keeps teaching them about the polar bears and sustainability. So we see climate anxiety entering into popular culture in this very kind of privileged elite setting, which I take up in some of my other work, actually. And we, of course, see this in Greta Thunberg and youth climate activists of the last few years. This image kind of captures the sense of there's sort of nothing we can do. We're surrounded by this very evocative image of doom surrounding us. We see apocalyptic fears in our regular newspaper cycles. And I took out a slide today just for time around in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of great research on the affective tonal register of most popular media sources that is getting increasingly worse, less positive emotions, more negative emotions. And I mean that in the kind of, research way. Of course, negative emotions also being really important for our lives. the caveat there. But the ways that negative news takes over, has been taking over much more over the last 20 years, is a really important part of the story too. And we see climate anxiety and eco grief taking on all kinds of new artistic and cultural forms. For example, when we had our very first memorial for the end of a glacier that was memorialized with this plaque. And I love to think about all the different ways that eco grief is manifesting and how people are processing it in different ways. And then we have this urgency that underlays all of the eco grief and the climate anxiety, that the timeline for doing something is about to be over, and there's no way we can get it done by that time. And so that's one of the sort of most recent IPCC reports. And of course, that urgency and that panic is necessary. It's not wrong, but it has psychological effects that I wanted to sort of tease apart, especially with my students, but in a broader, like, what does the research on this say when we have the drive of urgency? What does that do to our effectiveness in the work that we're trying to do? So just to sort of sum up this sort of generic definition of eco-anxiety: a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease triggered by an awareness of the ecological threats facing the Earth due to climate change. And I would say that eco-anxiety can be much more broad than climate anxiety, in that it can have relationships to things that aren't directly necessarily a function of climate change per se. I think of eco as a much broader umbrella, but you get the point. Okay, so the outline of where I want to just spend the rest of our short time together is just a really quickly not quickly. The main thing I want to talk about is why are emotions central to our climate advocacy, and a really quick, this is where I go quick, overview of the inner practices that I describe in my book, but I hope you all go out and buy A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, and then just end really quickly with one screen of some questions that might help with your own exploration around these inner practices. So why do emotions matter? Emotions are often put secondary to scientific work. You probably are familiar with this. There's a whole tradition of removing emotion and subjectivity from positivist scientific endeavors. And that is all very fine and great. And I think that there are really good reasons for that. And I'm not trying to say that we should undo all of that. However, as a result of that, we sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we ignore some of the science about how central emotions are to the work that we do. One of those things is that emotions actually dictate decision-making, the retention of knowledge, our ability to build community, our ability to sort through what a responsible actions are, our ability to sort of think through all the different biases that are cognitive biases that our brains automatically put up as a result of evolution that we can thank it for, but also don't get, that often can get in the way of the most effective decision-making for long-term action. And our ability to do meaningful work that makes us want to get up in the morning despite so many setbacks and bad news. So this is all the places I'm sure you can imagine how your emotional life is important for the work that you're trying to do for the stuff that you love about the environment and in your life. Secondly, the science of emotions shows that different emotions shape different actions in different ways. And so my argument here is that we ought to be much more scientific and strategic about that. If the science of emotions, for example, says that 76% of Americans don't like the emotion of guilt and are more likely to continue to shop more when they feel guilty, to provide comfort in that a negative emotion, then why should the environmental movement continue to deploy guilt as a strategy to get people to do action around the environment? Just as an example, that's just like the easy example. But we could take all the emotion wheel. Which emotions get people to involve themselves much more in environmental action on a daily basis for the long term? It turns out that because our brains are pleasure-seeking machines, the dopamine and all the different centers in the brain and the nervous system likes pleasure. Pleasure actually is a far more effective emotion to deploy when we want to get more people involved in climate work. So there's some interesting research that's happening around that. Thirdly, the suppression of so-called negative emotions like grief and anger, which is very much part and parcel of a kind of toxic positivity culture of America, where happiness really reigns king. The suppression of grief and anger, guilt, other things, the way that capitalism comes in to swoop us away from having to spend too much time with those emotions is to tell us that A, that is our individual problem, and B, that the best way to comfort ourselves from that is to shop some more. And this sort of message that we're getting from dominant society about what to do when we're feeling uncomfortable often just fuels the problem that we're uncomfortable about even more. and often can contribute to the fraying of relationships with each other, and certainly between humans and the more than human world. And so this is why you see a lot of people in the world of emotional intelligence, mindfulness, social emotional learning for kids, trying to figure out how do we deal better with negative emotions. It does harm to ourselves, but it also, I want to make the case, does harm to the more than human world as well. And then finally, our mental and physical, and this is again a sort of silly binary that on a different talk I could go dive into more about this binary. Our health affects our ability to engage in our work for the environment, and that seems super obvious. But I don't know how many there's a really wonderful study that's just come out about burnout in climate and environmental spaces. I'm happy to link that, or somebody can look that up in the notes. Put together from a climate burnout organization. And the punchline of that is that the people who are most concerned with fixing the environmental problems, who are the most driven by the urgency of the crisis, we love them, we want them feeling those things, but they also overdo it with depleting their own resources and depleting their own health, and do all this work at the cost of their own well-being. Because the assumption is that their own well-being is not a necessary strategy or tool for the movement. And there's this real self-sacrifice that happens in the result of that. And so the argument that I'm trying to make here is drawing on a lot of work that's happening, for example, in Black feminist thought and in different types of wisdom traditions, indigenous spirituality, that basically says your inner life, your inner ecosystem, your inner resolve, your inner well-being is actually the resource that the movement for climate change requires as much as anything. It is actually the fuel for that movement, to use a terrible metaphor, one that we're very familiar with, however. And so what happens when we decide that we're going to protect that resource as much as we're trying to protect external natural resources in the world? Okay, so that's the main thing. And I just love this image to kind of evoke the point that I'm trying to make a little bit more. This sort of iceberg model. This is, if you're familiar with systems theory and Donella Meadows and all the kind of work of systems theory, which I'm sure you all are, this won't be too foreign for you. At the tip of the iceberg, we see all these sort of events happening in the world that might cause us distress, authoritarianism, climate change, police brutality, whatever, all these different things that often are portrayed as disparate. But from a systems theory perspective, as you get down lower and lower in the iceberg, you start to see that these things are all connected. And where is the sort of biggest bang for our buck, greatest impact that we can have in changing what Donella Meadows calls the leverage points in our system to have the biggest effect to change the problems that we see in the world? Well, for Donella Meadows and for a lot of people who are turning their focus to this, it's at the bottom of the iceberg that this gets the biggest bang for our buck, focusing on emotional intelligence, mindsets, inner capacities as the most critical leverage point for addressing the polycrisis of the myriad events that otherwise we're just going around being like firefighters, putting out fires, putting band-aids on, or as another metaphor would say, pulling children out of the river instead of going upriver to stop children getting put into the river in the first place. There's all these metaphors to get people to think about systems theory and how the mindsets are at the kind of root cause of all of the different problems that we care about in the world. So turning ourselves to really think about the emotional life. Paul Hawken puts it this way: the most complex, radical climate technology on Earth is the human heart and mind, not a solar panel. And I just think that's just puts the point on everything I've just tried to say. We think of technology, we're investing so much in STEM, we're investing in all this technology, we have all this sort of optimism about capitalism and technology fixing all these problems at the cost of thinking about the human heart and mind as a kind of technology. I think what would happen if we invested as much in that technology as we do in what we think of as capital T technology? So going to the second part of my outline, the inner resources to answer that problem that I talk about in my book. Here's just a quick table of contents. I won't go through it all. I won't summarize the book. I won't even try that because that will just get me all wrapped up in myself. But I do think one of the things that has not been talked about a lot in books that are about what to do about climate change. We have a lot of books on, how you can reduce your ecological footprint, how you can become a vegan, how you can be a minimalist, and all these different types of, strategies to do this in your life. And really what this book is about is what is all right here that I can start to work on right now. It doesn't require any money, right? It does take some time, but this is right available to us right now. And I really wanted to think about what the inner life might offer to our climate action. And these are the answers. These are sort of chapters that try to address that question. So hacking the story was sort of one chapter that I think is the most obvious for us, that kind of ties back to my students living in this kind of story. Joanna Macy, the eco-Buddhist spiritual activist and psychologist who's in her 90s now, often talks about the great unraveling as a story that we live in, and tries to offer instead the story of the great turning being a more effective story to generate the kind of action that the moment requires of us. And so if we think about the kind of negativity bias that's happening in the news, as was example here of living in this great unraveling, what exactly does this do to our capacity to respond? One of the things that it does to our capacity to respond is it shoots us out of what Dan Siegel and psychologists call the window of tolerance of our nervous systems. And the window of tolerance, when we are in our window of tolerance, where our nervous systems are regulated, we have the best capacity to think about future problems and not just the ones that are right in front of us. We can think about the greater good instead of our own self-interest. There's all kinds of positive things that come from being able to cultivate and expand our window of tolerance. When we're triggered out of it, we're often either hyper aroused or hypo aroused. And this is that fight, flight, or freeze stuff that we've often heard about, our amygdala hijack, or whatever you want to call it, where we often don't make wise decisions in service of the stuff that we love, the planet, the future, much less even ourselves. So this becoming much more aware to our ability to respond effectively and wisely to the threats that are in front of us, we really do need to make sure that we're operating out of our window of tolerance. And then when we know we're not making big decisions about this stuff, knowing that we might do actually more harm than good when we're triggered out of our window of tolerance. This is not stuff that we're learning in popular culture. This is not stuff that, dominant public discourse and politics is teaching us by any stretch of the imagination. So we do have to kind of, on a grassroots level, develop these skills on our own and in collectivities. A second thing that it does to our capacity to respond is that we know from people who study polyvagal theory and all kinds of different things, and the sort of research in health about this, that chronic stress and trauma, even not just acute stress and trauma, but chronic, which is really what climate anxiety has become over time, has all of these knock-on effects. And I won't read all of these, but you can see how none of these effects, if you're reading it and listening to me at the same time, you can do that. None of these knock-on effects bode well for building a life-generating society, getting rid of the systems that are doing all the harm, figuring out how to strategically work together to build the world that we want instead. So you can see how the chronic stress and trauma at a collective level across our societies is not going to generate the kind of solutions that we're going to need in this moment. And I really love this concept that social psychologists have talked about called pseudo and efficacy. And it's a big clunky word that I hardly can say sometimes. But this is basically the idea that we are less likely to offer help in a situation, less likely to be altruistic, if we think that a problem is too big for us to solve, so that the positive feeling of solving even a small part of it is actually outweighed by the negative feeling of not being able to solve the whole. And I don't know about you all, but that is kind of the pervasive pseudo and efficacy is the pervasive feeling of my students. It's a pervasive feeling of why people don't get involved in environmental work. If you want to, go to the Yale Center for Climate Communication and look at their 6 how climate change, how people feel in America about climate change, the vast majority of people who talk about not being involved is because they feel pseudo and efficacious, right? Like, I'm just a drop in the bucket. What can one person do? I am just one person. The little bit that I can bite off by not eating meat seems worthless to me. I'm going to do this big sacrifice, but it's not going to matter. So that is the number one problem that dogs environmentalism and climate, and it really is a psychological trick we've been believing and that we swallow from mainstream culture, that we don't have any capacity that we are alone in our responses, and that any one thing that we do is not going to make a difference. And I would say that in my book and other places, there's really great research to refute that myth and to challenge pseudo and efficacy. And I just really, for the purposes of this talk, just want to bring it to your attention how destructive that is. So how is it destructive? This negativity bias in the news and our increased notion that we're living in a world of doom and gloom and risk leads us to this sort of story of live in a story of the great unraveling, which leads to the psychological effects of pseudo efficacy, what other psychologists call psychic numbing, where people just sort of block it out. That's hypoarousal, right? Or empathic distress, which is just like, I'm feeling too much of this stuff and I'm overloaded by it, so I'm going to just shut down. And this, as you can guess, actually makes the crisis worse, right? Because it leads us to more inaction, more apathy and fear. And that's not all the time. I'm not suggesting that this is 100% of the time, but this is what the research is showing in general is happening. And certainly what I was noticing happening in my students, and to get some of the language around this and to learn some of the research about how common this is was very helpful for me. So ending with this last slide for you, just questions for you to explore in your own work. What do these stories that we're living in reveal about us? How do they shape our actions? How do they shape your ability to get up in the morning? How do they shape the ability to do your work even when you think terrible, the news is terrible and it feels like you're just a drop in the bucket? How do you live in a story that keeps you working despite those things, right? What's the story that you're going to need to keep resourced, to keep your inner life going, to keep that climate technology of your heart and mind really sharp? You realize now that's not so much about which story is true and real, but which story actually leverages the human capacity for resilience to the greatest effect for climate justice and climate change. And to that point, what story does the planet need us to live in, right? So if we do believe the story that things are dire, okay, and we agree with that, what is the story of collective agency, of the great turning that might be happening, that accepts that reality, but also sees that the future could be potentially something other than what the doom and gloom is telling us? How is it that living in that story actually makes us much more effective in counterbalancing that pseudo-efficacy and counterbalancing the self-fulfilling prophecy of living in that story of doom and gloom? So just sort of thinking about the stories you're living in, whether or not they serve the things that you care about the most, and how they shape your energy, your action, your stamina in the work that you're doing for invasive species, for climate change, whatever it is that your particular passion around this is, your particular angle on climate change and environmental crisis. You are living in a story. You're not just scientists, right? You're doing this for a reason. And so getting a little bit more clear about that and leveraging the psychology of this to be more effective. So that's the end of my talk today, and I'm hoping that leaves us some time to talk, to Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. So great. You can see the reactions, and we do have questions in the chat. We only have about 2 quick, and thank you. We should have given you a full hour. We should have given you a full day. We could do this. We could talk about this all day, I'm sure.
It's a good challenge. It's a good challenge for me to get this tight.
You did great. You did great. So I'll just read one of the questions from the chat, and then maybe you'll be able to, you can see the chat, and if you have time to stay on, you could potentially answer 1 or 2 or more of the others. I'll ask this one. Some people feel climate anxiety together with other overlapping crises, such as the threat of invasive species degrading biodiversity. Any thoughts on how to flip the script on how we perceive threats to our well-being and build personal resilience?
Flip the script. Okay, maybe I need to read that. I see it here. Okay.
You see it?
Yeah, I see it. Thank you, Michael. Some people together with other crises. Yes. So some people have called this the poly crisis, right? And I think that's an effective term just to say, yeah, there's the overwhelm we feel at how many crises, right? And the systems theory approach of seeing how they're related. Yeah. Any thoughts on how to flip the script on how we perceive threats to our well-being? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, Michael, but I'm going to interpret in a way that I'm not sure is what you mean. So correct me if I'm wrong, but we often think of the threat to the natural resource or the threat to the climate or the planet, rather than thinking about the threat that those things are going to cause on our well-being and our health. I think maybe a thumbs up or something, and flip the script so the focus is more. Yeah. So yeah, that is absolutely what my whole entire book is about, to say that what our thoughts are, what the thought ecosystem in our minds are, the quality of our hearts, so whether we have compassion for our own failures, our own limitations, we can check how much our ego is participating in what we're trying to do. And that's what often causes us to feel that despair when things don't go right. So there's all kinds of how are we orienting our hearts and minds to the work that we're doing in a way that builds the most resilience and health? And how do we value as a natural resource what Charles Eisenstein calls inner sustainability? Because we have to talk about sustainability as like these big systems out there, right? But inner sustainability is an essential part of that puzzle of sustainability. So there are people who are really moving in this direction, but it is not the dominant way of thinking. And for the most part, and I'll try to find it and drop it in the link, unless somebody already did drop this in the link. This climate burnout data that just came out is really telling about how much we need more to focus on inner resilience for the work that we're trying to do, because the planet won't do any better if we all burn out, right? Trying to save it, you know? So to that point, and I'm going down like another little rabbit hole, Michael, and it's probably not what you meant to get me down, but you know, this urgency is really built on an infrastructure of what in American culture might be called the myth of individualism, that we are in fact alone in what we do. Urgency and pseudo and efficacy are tied together in that way, that we are always just alone in what we do. And if you actually do see us, each of us individually, as alone in what we do, of course, everything feels impossible to do. Of course, everything feels urgent and there's no way I single-handedly can do it. So part of the flipping the script is actually this turn to thinking about a story of the Great Turning. The Great Turning is not just about the future being bright or something. The Great Turning is about recognizing this groundswell of tons of people who are all doing this work and recognizing that we aren't alone, that buoys us in our work, gives us a chance occasionally to rest, knowing that other people are doing work while we're resting. We're not the only ones doing this. And making a concerted effort to see that work happening and celebrate that work happening, because we actually need that for our energy and for energizing us for the work that we're doing. So the Great Turning is really about seeing the collective work that's happening out there. And that's part of flipping the script, I think. I don't know if Michael, that's what you're asking.
Great.
But
Thank
yeah.
you.
We
Michael
won't
says thanks.
Yeah, we would not feel so urgent and despairing if we actually could see how much work is happening and realize that we're in such good company. And that's what Joanna Macy's talking about.
Such a good point. Thank you so much, Sarah. Again, maybe Sarah's able to stay on and answer a couple more of the questions in the chat, and we'll pass those on to people.